Mario Kart World has finally released, and with it came a whole wave of new, never before seen tracks. And well, you know me, I just had to try and make them in Mario Maker. In fact, my goal is to eventually make a detailed recreation of every track in the game and turn it into a super world. So what better place to start off with than with the game's first Grand Prix Cup, the Mushroom Cup. Not only is it the easiest to start off with, since like with every Mario Kart game, it's meant to familiarize yourself with the controls by introducing simple tracks, but every one of those tracks also happens to be new ones. Okay, if I'm being real, the track being new doesn't make any real difference, but making a track you've never seen before is just way more fun. So let's just pretend that that played a key role in my decision to start with the first track of the cup, Mario Bros. Circuit. In terms of the layout of Mario Bros. Circuit, there isn't much to speak about because of its very basic design. The only thing I was really doing was making the turns when they came up. And typically when it comes to turns, I like to use this setup, which uses springs, on-off blocks, a thwomp, and trampolines, because it's a pretty good way of making the car turn around onto the next part of the track without having to lose too much speed in the process. It's a recurring setup that you'll see appear often in these tracks. The only turn that was an exception to this was the first one at the beginning of the track. This turn is so wide and takes so much longer to actually clear that using the same setup I did for the others just wouldn't do it justice. So I decided to go with a bit of a different setup. Track blocks. I've actually found that they're, funnily enough, one of the better ways to at least somewhat recreate longer turns in Mario Maker. Once you drive onto them, they slowly begin to rise, and during that time, you've got to keep the Koopa car on the track block by constantly changing the car's direction until you reach the next part of the track. And now that I'm actually typing this out of my script, using track blocks actually simulates these turns to more of an extent than I thought. See, when you're drifting across these long turns in Mario Kart, typically you're constantly moving your joystick to the left and right so as to not go too far in one direction, which also happens to be what you're doing when you're riding a track block up. So you're basically doing the same thing, just one is in 2D and the other one is in 3D. And one of them also happens to be a lot cooler. But they'll never know which one I'm talking about. Now, would you believe me if I said that out of the 4 tracks that I've recreated for the Mushroom Cup, Mario Bros. Circuit actually happens to be my second favorite track to play, maybe even favorite, which if you think about it for a second is a little surprising considering just how simple it is in comparison to the other ones that are coming up. But there's one thing that I added to this track that really brings the entire thing together. See, after the third turn of the course, you enter into this big loop that takes you above the bottom half of the course. When I originally saw that, I wasn't all that sure how I'd make it. While it is essentially just a long turn, meaning I could use the track block idea again, I didn't think it would give the same vibes. On top of that, I thought the way the loop went over a part of the track you've been through before was a nice touch because it made the track feel more connected. What I wanted to do was make a long ramp that cut down through a section of the track you've already been through, and that would also lead you into the next part of the track. But it was really hard for me to think of a way to make that happen because using a slope that cut through the entire stage would essentially break the entire thing, if not just make it straight up impossible to clear. So what I had to do in order to make this work was actually break the slope in half so that it didn't get in the way when you first started the race. The slope would take you down to the bottom section of the track, which was previously inaccessible, and lead you to a couple bullet bill masts that you could use to reach the lap system area. I really liked how this part played because just like with the Mario Kart World version, it made the track feel connected, like you weren't just constantly driving into a new area. Something that was present in the other tracks I'd make, but not necessarily executed as well. To me, even more so than just the ramp that loops the player, the overall layout of the track is what really made it fun to play, and that looping section really ties it in all perfectly. Now, I briefly went over this, but like I said probably a couple seconds ago, I don't know at this point. In the bottom area, you need to jump off of this ramp to reach some bullet bill masts to make your way over to the lap system area. This part was meant to represent what is supposed to be a shortcut that you can take in the original version of the track, but in my version, it's not a shortcut, and rather just the final obstacle you need to overcome to reach the lap system area. Okay, you know what? I can already tell I'm gonna get annoyed saying lap system area so many times. I'm just gonna shorten it to LSA. Shouldn't be too hard to keep track of what that means, right guys? Right? Once I figured out how to make the looping ramp, I had the general layout of the track complete. In fact, I could have just called it right there and moved on to the next track. And that's exactly what I did. So moving on to Crown City, I wasn't okay. I'm just joking, obviously. Like I said at the beginning of this video, I wanted to make a detailed recreation of every one of these tracks. Naturally, this wasn't going to cut it, so I went from this to this. Now we're talking. Now, before we move on to Crown City, for real this time, I want to address the allegations. I mean, a question that you guys have probably asked yourself at some point while watching so far. And that's, why am I using the 3D world style? It's no secret that one of the best, if not the best way to make a Mario Kart track in Mario Maker is by using the Super Mario World style. Because it has the P-Balloon, which gives you omnidirectional movement in the air, you can essentially create a Mario Kart track based on a top-down view of the minimap. So again, that begs the question, why am I not using said style? Well, you see, while the P-Balloon in theory and in practice does give you a more accurate depiction of the track you're making, I've never really felt like I was playing Mario Kart. Like, yes, you are able to make an almost one-to-one track layout, but it comes at the cost of almost everything else? You can't have gliding sections, you can't have power-ups or ramps, things like water sections just don't work because you're slower in it, and all of this is on top of the fact that you're not even driving. I mean, it's called Mario Kart. I've never really gotten that illusion of, oh, you're racing in a top-down version of the track, because to me it always just feels like you're flying all over the place. Which is why I prefer to go with the 3D world style, which has the Koopa car, and that allows for much more fast-paced races, creative setups to make, and of course the fact that you're actually driving. Basically, my point is using the 3D world style to make Mario Kart tracks usually results in more fun courses. Or maybe I'm just trying to go against the norm, I don't know. Anyway, Crown City, the New York City of the Mario universe. We don't talk about New York minute. Now, at first glance, you'd probably think the design of this course would follow a layout similar to that of the Mario Kart Tour tracks from the Booster Course Pass, with the incomprehensible minimap and overall lack of sight read friendliness, but I think the devs actually did a pretty good job of making a city track that didn't feel like half the race was you trying to figure out where you're going. And the reason I'm mentioning this at all is because I, ironically, ended up making my version of Crown City look like a tour track. It'll probably become more apparent once you see the completed version of it. Unlike Mario Bros Circuit, Crown City actually has a decently high amount of turns, and so when I was building the track, I tried to incorporate almost every single one of those turns, which resulted in the track looking like kind of a mess. But I was actually fine with that because I think it helped create that bustly ceiling feeling that the devs were probably trying to create when they were making this track. There were a couple additions that I made to my version of the track, with the biggest one being this ramp here that loops the player again through a section of the track they've already gone past. And I also removed a couple turns, or in some cases, entire sections like the skate park area. Which actually brings me to what was my biggest concern while building this track. Its length. Crown City is designed to be a course with continuous laps, meaning you're almost never driving through an area you've been past before. And what that means for me is that I'm almost always having to add something new, which is a problem because Mario Maker doesn't give you a lot of space to work with. And that problem is even further accentuated when you're working with a car. It's why I said earlier that I tried to make every single turn, because I couldn't. It just wasn't realistic. See this long highway that you drive on for like, I don't know, 20 seconds? In my version, you drive on it for like 20 blocks, not even a full screen. Now, at the end of the day, this was only so much of a problem because the subworld was always right there if I legitimately ran out of space, but having to go through the process of dismounting the car, going through a pipe transition, re-entering the car, and then continuing the race just broke the immersion so much that I really wasn't fond of the idea. So I really did my best to make everything fit in the main area. Now, most of the track was relatively simple to design because for the most part it was just turns, but the part that gets a little more interesting is starting from lap 2, where you have to trick off of these buildings with solar panels on them? I've got no clue. My version is similar to this in the sense that you have to jump from one semi-solid to the next and you'll fall if you mess up, but it's also different because once you actually clear all the jumps and think you're safe, you have to do it again. Okay, if I'm being serious, I did not do this to be a troll or something. Like I said, I was trying to make sure I had enough room to build the whole track, and I couldn't make you go to the left any further because at that point you'd be going through a section of the track you've already been through. And at that point, I'm just building an entirely separate course. So the reason I make you go back again is so that you can use those semi-solids to progress further into the track. and you happen to progress into what is probably the most iconic part of the track, or at least what will probably become the most iconic part, the jump into the Crown City Golden Tire. Now, despite the fact that I immediately knew how I was going to build this, I still had trouble building it. Okay, I know that doesn't make sense, but you'll get it, probably. First of all, my design of it looked less like a tire and more like a diamond that was split open. Then I decided to move the whole thing down a couple blocks because most of you know my whole spiel with it's gotta be symmetrical, and this was just like triggering me or something. And of course, I had to spend another 5 to 10 minutes essentially making the thing from scratch again before I was finally content with it. So, you know, call in a level creator's day of work. From there, you have to check off a couple of buildings before using a glider ramp to fly into the final lap of the track. This wasn't difficult by any means, but if you'll notice, while I was building the part leading up to the flying section, it finally happened. I reached the screen length limit. Now, I don't know if you guys noticed, but I still had an entire lap to make. Now, fortunately, I could still make the gliding section since it came right before a turn, meaning I could make the flying section go to the left, so at least that part was safe. But now the only real space I had was this area above the goal, so I had to make a decision. A, I used the subworld, reluctantly so, to make a third and final lap, or B, I used the less than half a screen worth of space I have left to build the most condensed and unintuitive lap 3 ever seen. Yeah, I'm a pretty stubborn guy. Now, to be fair, the third lap in the actual track is also pretty uneventful. Like, it's literally just another 3 to 4 turns and then the finish line, so there's only so much I had to work with. But anyway, with the final section done, I was also done building the track, which means it was time to polish it up. Not nearly as impressive as my work with Mario Bros. Circuit, but beggars can't be choosers. Crown City was without a doubt my least favorite track out of the 4. It just didn't feel like much of a track, especially when compared to what I consider to be either my favorite or second favorite track, Mario Bros. Circuit. But there's a reason I can't say with certainty that it's my favorite track, and that's because it's competing with the next track I made, Whistle Stop Summit. God, I keep doing that. The whole concept behind this track is that you're racing through a mountain, but you're not the only one driving here because the course's main obstacle, this train, is also traveling throughout the entire thing. And that's what makes this course so interesting, because throughout most of it, you can either choose to take the normal path away from the train, or you can actually go along the same path as it by rail grinding on the train tracks, which presents more risk since there's the possibility of running into the train, but at the same time, taking the train tracks can also be faster than the normal path. So there's a lot of choices to be made throughout the entire race. Now, while I did realize this when I first started building my recreation of it, I didn't necessarily execute the idea of having multiple paths very well. You see, I'm the type of person who needs to take a break in between doing things, like going from recording a script to editing it. Usually I'll finish reading a script and then go watch videos or something for like half an hour, at the very least. So basically, I can't go from doing one task to the next. And the same is also true for when I'm working on multiple levels in Mario Maker. Whenever I try to make back-to-back levels, my brain just starts to get so worn out that I legitimately start to make horrible levels, even when I try not to. Well, not necessarily horrible levels, but more so that the design of them makes no sense. I just can't think creatively anymore, to put it in simple terms. Yet for some reason, after spending over 2 hours working on Crown City, I decided to jump right into Whistle Stop Summit, and certainly not to the surprise of me, the level was awful, by my standards. So even though I did make a decent amount of progress into the track, I ultimately decided to scrap the whole thing and start again from scratch the next day. So now that I was actually fully functional, I took a better look at the course and realized that it immediately starts by giving you 2 paths to choose from. You can either take the normal path, or if you go to the left, you can use the train tracks, which is faster than taking the regular path. So instead of going with whatever this was supposed to be, I started off the track by presenting the player with the option of either going straight, which in this case represents the normal path, or jumping up to take a series of conveyors up to the top of the level. Now this is faster because I purposely made the bottom path slower to go through, but it's also a little more difficult since I added a row of bullet bill launchers on conveyors that you have to jump over and avoid. Well, it's not necessarily difficult to avoid, but more so that if you don't avoid it, then you get punished pretty hard. Should be pretty obvious just based on the structure of the launches, but they're meant to represent the train. After that, the track ends up recombining into one over a bridge, and from there you have to drive into the mountain. Neither of those parts were necessarily hard to make. I mean, the bridge part was especially easy to make because I didn't include it to begin with, which was simply because I needed to conserve more space. And I actually like the version of the mountain section that I made in my original recreation, so I just used it again. Once you drive out of the mountain, the track continues to expand on its idea of taking the train tracks or the normal path, but because of the layout of both paths, neither is arguably the fastest route to take. It's more so the combination of switching from one path to the other that allows you to take this section as fast as possible. So I kinda tried to replicate that same idea by making 2 layers of hills that you could switch between by using mushroom platforms. After that, you just have to take one final turn before reaching the finish line, but since I had a little more space to work with, I decided to add another section where you have to jump over the train as a last obstacle. And after that, I just added one final turn that led into the LSA and the track was complete. But you know the drill at this point. It wasn't actually complete. Now it is. Now, considering how I kinda hyped up Whistle Stop Summit to potentially be my favorite track here, I really didn't go into as much depth as you'd think. Might have even felt anticlimactic. And that's really just due to the design of these tracks. There's only so many ways I can make turns, gliding section, boost panels, all of that stuff. So if every recreation I talk about, there's less to talk about. But one track that probably won't end up having the same issue, I'm saying probably because I haven't typed the part for this track yet, is DK Spaceport! That's because out of all the tracks here, Mario Bros. Circuit, Crown City, Whistle Stop Summit, none of them compare to the creativity that's present in this track. In case it wasn't obvious, DK Spaceport is 100% inspired by the classic Donkey Kong arcade game. And because that's the case, the track layout here is the most different from any of the other tracks I've talked about so far. You're essentially driving up this thing made up of girders, and as you make your way up onto every floor, there will be unique obstacles that you need to get past. The first lap has nothing. Okay, that's kind of weird. But then the second lap has barrels that you need to avoid, and the third lap also has barrels. Okay. Oh, but then the fourth lap is a sort of platforming section, and the same also goes for the fifth lap? What? Okay, but then you get into the final lap where Robo Donkey Kong is throwing barrels. He's throwing barrels. Maybe a more appropriate term is unique challenges, not obstacles. Now, before I can talk about the meat of this track, there is actually a bit of build up to it that I should mention. It's nothing crazy really. The track starts by giving you ramps to trick off of before taking you into the first turn, which has 2 paths of which you can choose from, before finally making you take a glider ramp onto the actual track. With all of these elements being things that I've made before, there really wasn't much of a struggle in building it here. The track itself is pretty vertically structured, for obvious reasons, so I made a vertical sub area to give myself more than enough room for everything I needed to build. Like I said earlier, every lap/floor has a different challenge, so I tried to keep the spirit of that by having every floor feature a different obstacle. I don't know what they were thinking with lap 1 because it's practically an empty road, so there wasn't much I had to work with there. Although technically everything leading up to lap 2 is part of lap 1, including that section before the actual track, so I suppose in that regard it's fine, but if we look at the track in a whole, then my point still stands. But the second lap is where we start to see the use of the barrels, which I ultimately decided to go with spike balls to represent, since they function in a similar fashion. I also added springboards as a way of avoiding the spike balls, since that was also an element present in the original track. The section played pretty well, but the only problem I had was the fact that you only have 2 screens or 48 blocks worth of horizontal space when you're in a vertical sub area. The time it takes to drive the Koopa Car 48 blocks is equivalent of having Mario travel... I actually don't know. I was supposed to look this up before actually reading this part, but I kind of forgot, so... just use your imagination, I'm sure you get the idea. Anyway, it wasn't the end of the world, but it was still unfortunate because if I had even one more screen to work with, it'd seriously make all the difference. Anyway, the third lap of the track also features barrels, as we previously found out, but instead of rolling towards you, they're going perpendicular to you. You know, 90 degrees. I don't think I needed to say that, but just making sure. It's possible to make a similar setup using pipes facing downwards with spike balls coming out from them, but the only problem was that the spike balls would then roll towards you when they hit the ground, and that didn't work quite as well as I wanted. Fortunately, it didn't take me too long to realize that lava bubbles could also fill in for the spike balls, See, when they come out of a pipe, they're intangible to anything, so they could just phase through the ground and never come back. The fourth lap is when things start to get tough, because now we're talking about the challenge on this floor being rail grinding rather than an actual obstacle. I had no idea how to implement that mechanic before, and that certainly wasn't any different now. So instead of looking at what the literal obstacle was, I chose to look at what the goal of the section was. And to me, it seemed pretty obvious, giving you, the player, multiple paths to choose from. You could choose to stay down where there's multiple ramps to trick off of, or that can take you back up, or you can go up onto the rails from the get-go, and even up there are so many other rails that you can jump to as you make your way through. So I went with a similar approach by using semi-solids of varying proportions. I assumed that using the rails was probably a little bit faster than staying down below, so I made a bit of an inconspicuous path that you could take to reach the next section faster if you could stay up top. That brings me to lap 5, which also focuses on using a core mechanic of the game, wall riding. Obviously, this was something I also wasn't sure how to make in Mario Maker, so once again, I tried looking at the goal of the section. At first glance, it probably looked like having multiple paths was the idea again, which wouldn't be wrong because, I mean, just the start has 4 different ways you can choose to take, but I already went with that idea before, so I decided to look even deeper. That's when I realized that this part kinda reminded me of a maze. I either have a very creative outlook on things, or am very delusional. So anyway, I went with the maze idea and used donut blocks along with crates to block certain paths. I'm sure I had a reason why I used donut blocks as the floor here, but I can't remember for the life of me, so let's just pretend it was important. Then we have the final lap, where you face off against Robo Donkey Kong. He just throws large barrels at you, and since I used spike balls to represent barrels, I went with the same idea again, but used bigger spike balls.
Daring today, aren't we?
One change that I did add was replacing the floor with smooth slopes, which some of you might be wondering why I hadn't done that from the beginning, since it would technically be a more accurate portrayal of the track. And that was because I didn't want the player to be constantly spamming the jump button, since slopes do make you drive a lot slower. But I wanted to stay faithful to the original version, so I overlooked that problem. But it created another problem in that jumping over spike balls wasn't possible anymore because angles and stuff. But it actually wasn't an issue because it gave me an excuse to add trampolines since they're present in the final lap. But okay, that was the last one, okay. I also wanted to add some sort of pixel art of Donkey Kong somewhere in the final lap, but are we really calling this Donkey Kong? Come on, man. And of course, the last thing I did was add in all the aesthetics for the track. The actual version always looked like it had a city under construction type of look, even though it's called DK Spaceport, but we don't talk about that. So anyway, I went with my arguably better idea and came up with this. I also decided to take things a step further by having every lap in the subworld have a different aesthetic. I couldn't go all out because I did actually run out of material to work with, but sometimes less is best. But with DK Spaceport having been complete, I had finally finished making all the tracks in the Mushroom Cup. And after all of that, I can say with 100% confidence that I still don't know which one was my favorite out of those 2 tracks. But you can let me know which one was your favorite in the comments below, and maybe I'll have come to a decision by the time I make a follow-up video.